Konnichiwa minasan, and welcome to the class in the second lecture series on Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture. So, in our last class we learnt how to ask and how to give permission with temo ii desu ka, if you remember. So, well, this time also we are going to do the same thing, but we will do it with adjectives and nouns. Last time we had done it with verbs. Also in this class we will learn how to say it is alright not to do a certain thing. So, well, let us see the kaiwa very quickly and see how much you understand, how much you are able to catch, and then I will do the grammar. So, well, Rao-san, dou shimashita ka?
先生、さっき子供の学校から電話がありました。私は学校行かなければなりませんから。
じゃあ早く行ってね。
でも実験をしていますから今行ってもいいですか？
大丈夫よ。実験のことは心配しなくてもいいです。太郎くんに言って。
じゃあ太郎に言います。ありがとうございます。失礼します。
So this is a small kaiwa between Sensei and Rao-san. Some things you would have been able to catch, like you have dou shimashita ka, this you have done, temo ii desu ka we just did in our last class, and this is what we are going to do today. So, I will read the kaiwa now. Rao-san, dou shimashita ka? Dou is what happened. Dou, what happened. Dou shimashita ka? What is the matter? Do you want to say something? Any of these depending on situation. Sensei, saki, earlier, kodomo no gakko kara, from, denwa ga arimashita, there was a phone. Watashi wa gakko e ikanakereba narimasen. So, I have to or must go to school. Kara, and he leaves it incomplete. Why? He does not want to say all of it to Sensei. He is leaving half of it for Sensei to say. So, what does Sensei say? Ja, hayaku itte ne. Hayaku is hayai. Hayaku itte ne. Quickly please go. Demo jikken o shite imasu kara ima itte mo ii desu ka? So, over here intonation is rising. He says, but I am doing experiments right now. Is it all right if I go immediately? Daijobu yo. So, daijobu yo is something that you can use only to juniors, younger to you. Daijobu desu yo is also the same thing, only a little polite. So, because he is sensei, he says daijobu yo, it is absolutely all right. Jikken no koto wa about jikken, regarding jikken, shimpai shinai de, don't worry. Or he says shimpai shinakute mo ii desu, it is all right not to worry about the experiment. Taro-kun ni itte, meaning just tell Taro-kun about the jikken and you can leave. Arigatou gozaimasu. So, over here I have purposely left it. You have to always add sensei because he is your senior in age and in rank in all respects. Not just arigatou gozaimasu, sensei arigatou gozaimashita can also be done, and shimasu is also done. Shitsure shimasu, please excuse me. Now, I will take your leave. So, this was a small conversation. We will see what we have here now. So, there is sensei and saki. You can see sen and saki, two readings for this character over here. Then there is kodomo, gakko we did earlier, denwa you know. Then kodomo is, this is gakko, and kodomo over here, very, very simple, and like this, kodomo. Then you have shimpai, we are going to do shimpai soon, and shitsure, shimasu, you did it earlier. Then, as I told you last time, we learnt to give and ask permission with verbs. So, today we will see how it is to be used with nouns and adjectives, where you will see that the meaning is not always permission. It can be contradicting something, where the meaning could be although, in spite of, it's all right. So, let us see how it is done. Now, we did with verbs last time in te form, te mo ii desu ka? So, today with adjectives you have yasui, yasui, remove the I from here and put kute. This is the te form for adjectives, and this also means and joins adjectives with adjectives. Then you have na adjectives, heta or genki or kirei, and with nouns. Na adjectives and nouns follow a similar pattern. Not much is to be removed, the word is to be used as is. Mira, kaban wa chotto takai desu yo. So, with particle yo, always the intonation is rising and it shows that it is informal. They are friends. So, takakute mo ii desu. It is all right even if it is. Even if it is. Although it is takai, even though it is takai, in spite of the fact that it is takai, I will buy it. Takakute mo kaimasu. And if you put yasui over here, then yasukute mo kawanai. Even if it is cheap, I will not buy it. Now, instead of kaban, you can replace it with hon, tokei, kutsu, ryori. And what are the adjectives? Furui, takai and mazui. So, you can make hon wa takai desu yo or hon wa furui desu yo. Furukute mo kaimasu. Yume na hon desu kara furukute mo kaimasu. Tokei wa takai desu yo. Kirei desu kara kaimasu. Because it is kirei. Suki desu kara kaimasu. So, kirei, suki desu kara kaimasu. Na adjectives. Ryori wa mazui desu. It is not good, not tasty. Ryori is cuisine or food. Demo, okasan ni, haha ni warui kara tabemasu. Or mazukute tabemasu. Haha ni warui kara tabemasu. I will eat because otherwise it will be very mean to mother. Or mazukute mo, even if it is mazui, although it is mazui, haha ni warui kara tabemasu, or okusan ni warui kara tabemasu. She will feel bad, so I will have it. I think te mo ii desu ka is very, very clear now. Now, there is a kanji. I am again making this kanji for you so that you are able to recognize. This is takai. Then we have tokei. Toki you have done. Jikan, ji and kan over here. Okay. So, ji, ichiji, niji. Then same kanji is used for tokei. Tokei. How will you make it? I will make it here as there is little space there. So, ji and then over here, and then you know this character, this is to say and this is kei. So, this makes it tokei. This means to measure and this means time. So, you can very well understand what it is. Now, we have another one here, ryori. So, like this, then of course, this is not the stroke order. The stroke order is this, this and then this. What does this mean? This is zairyo, meaning material, and this is ri, which means logic. Logic. So, ryo, ri. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and then 10 and 11. So, lot of kanjis we are doing here because all these kanjis are important. They will come in your N4 if any of you is preparing for N4, which is the proficiency test. So, it is good to learn these kanjis. Now, Hana and Mira again. Mira, dores wa chotto furui desu, or ano or ano ne. So, again very informal, any of these could be used. Dores wa chotto furui desu. The difference over here is this is hesitation and this is just getting some time to construct what you want to say later. This also is used for construction, but also involves hesitation. Iro wa kirei dakara furukute mo kaimasu. So, the color is very pretty, kirei dakara. So, remember before kara you will always use da for na adjectives. Now, there is another kanji which is furui. I am also doing the easy kanjis with you. Furui, just a plus and kuchi. Furui. Takai desu kara kaimasen, or yasui kara kaimasu. So, you can use any adjective that you want, and with I adjective you do not have to remove anything, you can just use kara after that as is. Then, iro wa kirei dakara furukute mo kaitai. I want to buy, or takakute mo kaitai. Even if it is takai, I want to buy. Even if it is furui, I want to buy. Then we have another one here, uchi wa kirei kedo, but. So, the moment you have but, something else is going to follow from this. It will just be the opposite of what is said over here. Uchi wa kirei kedo, heya wa semai desu. So, even though it is beautiful, it is very small. Semai is narrow or small. Senta kara chikai node, sore demo ii desu, or semakute mo ii desu. Mo is missing over here. So, semakute mo ii desu. Senta kara, from the center it is very close by, and node over here, kara and node. Meaning is the same, giving reason for something. Kara is informal, just giving information, just stating something, whereas node, when you put, then the listener will always understand that the reason is very genuine. The reason that you are putting up is genuine. It is understood by the listener as well. Senta kara chikai node, it is close to the center, so semakute mo ii desu. Sore demo ii desu. This sore demo over here is for semai. There is more practice for you. Koko wa totemo urusai desu. Urusai is noisy. Urusai desu. Totemo, exceptionally, or very. Degree of the adjective. Koko wa totemo urusai desu. Gakko kara chikai kara urusakute mo daijobu desu. It is all right. Daijobu means all right. So, urusakute mo, even if it is urusai. And the kanji, though we have done for daijobu, I am doing it again over here with you, and this is what it is, daijobu. Please remember, it all looks very similar but is different. 問題は難しいですね。ミラ、問題は難しいですね。難しくてもやってみます。Even though it is 難しい、I will try and see. やってみたい。I want to do. And やりたい。Same thing, I want to do. Over here, verb in te form plus mitai. Over here, just tai form, which means want, whatever the verb is saying. So, I repeat it so that it is very clear to you how to use these forms. Kanji for muzukashi is actually muzukashi, but we will do it a little later. We will break it up and then learn the kanji, but at the moment you just concentrate on daijobu. 今日は忙しいからしません。今日は忙しいから、今日は忙しいから仕事しません or やりません。Then he says 忙しくても even though I am busy やります。I will do it. Although I am busy, even though I am busy, in spite of the fact that I am busy, I will do the work. 雨が降っても行きます。Even if it rains, I will go. 薬は苦くても飲まなければなりません。So, 薬は苦い。苦い。Remove the I, put kute, niga kute. Even if it is nigai, I will still have it or I must have it. Even if this is in negative, the meaning is you have to do it. It's a must for you. It is required. So, nakereba narimasen is a must. We have done it earlier. We are going to do it again today. Compare it and then you will understand. So, now this is Tanoshi. Now, what is this? This also we did last time. On and again Tanoshi is ongaku. This on means sound. Ongaku is music. Ongaku. This is Tanoshi. Then gakki. Gakki is again Tanoshi like this and then ki. We will do the ki later. We are just doing these kanjis so that you remember. Then a very similar looking kanji which is like this, again same Tanoshi like this, is kusuri, means medicine. So, these two are very similar. Thus, these are the two kanjis that we are doing. Look at them again and again and you will not be making any mistake later. So, well, how is the form made now? Takai, nagai, mazui. Remove the I and put kute meaning and then you join it and use it with mo I desu ka. Basic meaning is and it is also the te form for adjectives. How will you use it with nouns now? So, let us see. Kono shigoto wa gakusei janakute mo ii desu. Or kono shigoto wa Tanaka-san janakute mo ii desu. What does it mean? That even if it is not Tanaka-san who is doing the shigoto, it is all right. This particular shigoto, if the gakuseis are not doing, if students are not doing, it is absolutely all right. It is not necessary to have students for this work. Ja nakutemo in negative. Kono shigoto wa gakusei demo ii desu. Even gakusei can do this shigoto. I have no objection. Mizu demo ii desu. So, there can be a situation, nodo ga kawakimashita. Nani o nomimasu ka? Mizu demo ii desu. Mizu is also all right. Rao and Mira talking together. So, Nihongo ga nigate nanode happyou shimasen. So, I am not good at it. Nigate means not good at something. Nihongo ga nigate na no de, na adjective. Happyou o shimasen. Nihongo ga nigate nanode happyou o shitaku nai. Or he could also say Nihongo ga nigate kedo happyou o shinakereba narimasen. Or Nihongo ga dekinai kedo happyou o shinakereba narimasen. Then answer is nigate demo daijoubu desu yo. It's all right even if you are not good at Japanese. Demo ii desu. Also, even though, in spite of the fact that you are not good, it's still all right. So, nigate is here. What is this? We just did furui. Add this on top and it becomes nigate. I am going to cover it later also, then you will see it properly. So, now Nihongo ga nigate nanode happyou shimasen. And Mira says, nigate demo shita hou ga ii desu yo. Even though you are not good at it, it's better that you do it. Then, kondo no nichiyoubi ni tenis o shimasen ka? You did it earlier in the beginning where verb in negative with ka is a polite invitation. So, kondo no nichiyoubi ni tenis o shimasen ka? Ii desu yo. One answer. Then, second answer is heta demo ii desu ka? I am not good at it. I am not so proficient at it. Sore demo ii desu ka? Is it all right after that as well? Daijoubu desu yo. Watashi mo jouzu ja arimasen. I am also not that good. Now you can also use kedo over here instead of demo. How is that and how does the meaning change? Heta demo ii desu ka? I am not even good at it. Is it all right? Or when you use kedo, heta kedo ii desu ka? I am not good at it, but is it all right with you? So, over here it is more direct. It is more straightforward. So, you are asking over here very directly, I am not good, is it all right with you? And heta demo ii desu ka? A softer version of kedo. Meaning is the same, more polite. Daijoubu desu yo. It's absolutely all right. And in Japanese, this is cultural also, I would like to tell you that you don't say I am very good at something, I am jouzu. It would be like boasting, and that's one thing that the Japanese do not do. So, jouzu ja arimasen. I am not good at it, even though you may be very good, but yeah, mada mada desu. I am not jouzu. Now, there is kanji for you. As I had said, this is furui, simple furui, a plus ju and kuchi. Now, you can see furui is also over here in nigai. Nigai. 1, 2, 3 and furui makes it nigai. Then nigai kusuri. So, kuchi, nigai, and again the same thing over here and kusuri, nigai kusuri. Then of course, we have done Tanoshi, so I do not have to repeat it again. And then nigate. Nigate is also like this. ni, ga, te, and te you have done like this. So, not good at something, and very similar to nigate is heta, again this heta, and jozu is like this, jozu. You will be seeing these again and again, and you will be more comfortable towards the end. Now, a simple question by A-san, which is nanika nomitai desu ne. So, he says, I want to have something. Nodo ga kawakimashita kara. Nodo ga kawakimashita node. Nanika nomitai desu ne. I want to drink something. You have done nanika in 26 lesson. So, biru wa ikaga desu ka? Polite for do desu ka? Generally, when you are asking somebody to drink or eat, then do desu ka? Or asking their opinion, then do desu ka? Or ikaga desu ka? Now, the answer could be biru demo ii desu. Biru demo ii desu. Of course, nobody says biru demo ii desu. I don't mind beer also. Everybody will say want to have beer, but this is just for practice. Now, dare ga kono sakubun o kakimasu ka? Sakubun is essay. So, dare ga, who is going to write? Watashi wa kakimasu, one answer. Watashi wa kakitai desu. I want to write. Then, watashi ga kaite mo ii desu ka? Now, asking permission. Is it all right if I write it? So, verb in te form plus mo ii desu ka? Mira-san kaita hoga ii desu. It is better that Mira-san writes it. Or watashi yori, more than me, Mira-san no hoga, it's better that Mira-san writes it. And then very casually, Mira-san demo ii desu. So, this demo over here is very, very informal, and I don't mind if it is anyone. So, it could also be Mira-san. That is the kind of impression that you give with this kind of a sentence, Mira-san demo ii desu. This person also ii desu, this person also ii desu. By the way, Mira-san also ii desu. So, generally not to be used casually or not to be used in formal situations. Now, we know how to ask and give permission and also refuse or show objection. We have done lot of practice now in our previous slides. So, now we can learn to say it is all right if you do not do a certain activity. So, how to use te mo ii desu ka in a negative manner. Let us see how it is done. The negative for mo ii desu ka is nakute mo ii desu ka or nakute mo ii desu. It basically means that it is not required, it is not necessary, it is not compulsory, it is all right, or is it all right to do a certain activity. So, well, you are sick, you are having lot of kusuri, now you are getting better. So, genki ni natta node, I have become all right. Mo, now at this point, kusuri o nomanakute mo ii desu. It is all right that I do not have kusuri now as I am better. Now, you can compare it with nomanakereba narimasen. Genki janai node kusuri o nomanakereba narimasen. I have to have. I must take medicine. So, you will see that this is exactly the opposite of this or vice versa, and we will practice it right now and see how it is done. Now, you have done group 1, group 2, group 3 in te form earlier. Basically, in group 1, the verb takes TTE NDE, shite, ite and ide. Group 2 takes just te, and group 3 as our irregular verbs will always take shite and kite, and you will see that the verb changes itself from mass form. So, remove the mass and put the te form of the verb. We will see how it is done. So, ikimasu, make negative ikanai and ika nakute. Remove the I from here and nakute. As it is coming from the negative, the meaning obviously is negative over here. Nomimasu, nomanai and nomanaku. Na is over here, I is removed and kute is put. Kaimasu, kawanai, kawanakute. Why wa over here? Because kau, group 1, is an irregular verb, and this is where it changes in the negative. Tabemasu, tabenai, this is group 2. So, tabenai and tabenakute. Then nemasu, nenai and nenakute. And shimasu, shinai, shinakute. Luckily, it does not change much, but with kimasu it becomes konai. These are group 3 verbs. Remember and learn them like this only. Now, there is a very nice picture of someone sneezing, kaze, because they have cold. So, how are we going to use it with nakute mo ii desu ka? Let us see. Kaze hiite iru kara. Kaze is cold. Otherwise, kaze as a noun means wind. Kaze hiite iru. Hiku is the verb. Hiku. Hiite iru. I have kaze. Thus, happyo shinakute mo ii desu ka, or rising intonation, or happyo shinakute mo ii desu. It is all right that you do not do happyo or presentation as you have a kaze, and when you are asking for permission, then ka will be used. Then kaze hiite iru kara gakko ni ikanakute mo ii desu. It is all right if I do not go to school, or asking permission, then ka will be put. Now, you have sumetai, and let us see. Atsui kara sugu nomanakute mo ii desu, or sumetai kara sugu nonda hou ga ii desu. So, we can use atsui over here and atsui. Kohi wa atsui uchi ni nonde kudasai. While it is hot, please drink it. And atsui kara sugu nomanakute mo ii desu. Over here, don't have to drink it immediately because it is very, very hot. Kohi wa chotto nigai desu. It's a little bitter. Chotto nigai desu. Ja, nomanakute mo ii desu. Don't have to drink it. Over here, I have written nigai. The chotto has not been added. Kohi wa nigai desu. A very, very direct statement. The person may feel bad who has made coffee. So, you just add this chotto to soften your sentence and mean exactly the same. So, ja nomanakute mo ii desu. It's all right not to drink it. Then, ima sugu denwa shinakute mo ii desu. There is no need to rush immediately. You can call later. Kakanakute mo ii desu. To do denwa. And to do again same thing denwa. So, different ways, different situations you can use nakute mo ii desu or nakute mo ii desu ka if you are asking a question. Then, you have kaze hiita kara happyo shinakute mo ii desu. You had this in your previous slide. So, kaze hita kara. So, I already have a kaze. This used over here is for something else. So, kaze hita kara happyou shinakute mo ii desu. You do not have to do happyou. Happyou is presentation. And kaze desu kara, because of kaze, happyou shinakute mo ii desu. If you want to ask a question, well, ii desu ka. Kaze demo, even if you have kaze, in spite of the fact that I have kaze, happyou shinakereba narimasen. I have to do it, it is a must. Ima sugu denwa shinakute mo ii desu. You don't have to call immediately. Ima sugu denwa shinakereba narimasen. Doshite desu ka? Doshite? 部長がそう言いましたから。部長がそう言いましたから。He has said. This kara is the reason and not from. He has said so, so I have to do it right now. Must. So, you can see how these two can be used and what it means. They are just the opposite of each other. Verb te mo ii desu ka, polite, and verb te ii, that is itte mo ii, very, very informal. You can see the intonation is rising and to be used in informal situations and to juniors. Verb te mo ii desu ka when you are asking permission from seniors or in formal situations. Sumimasen, kono enpitsu o tsukatte mo ii desu ka? So, there is this picture here and this girl is asking sumimasen. So, whenever you are asking, whenever there is a ka, you want a favor, then sumimasen. Kono enpitsu o tsukatte mo ii desu ka? Can I use it? Koko de akai enpitsu o tsukatte mo ii desu ka? So, anything you can ask. Sumimasen, kono enpitsu de kaite mo ii desu ka? Kono enpitsu, this particular enpitsu de kaite mo ii desu ka? Can I write with this pencil? Sumimasen. Now, how will you say in a very formal situation? People you do not know. How will you ask when you do not know somebody and you still want a favor? So, sumimasen. Kono enpitsu de kaite mo yoroshii desu ka? Is it all right if I write with this pencil? So, yoroshi is very, very polite for e. Now, this person wants to sit over here or maybe wants to use the chair. So, how is he going to ask? Koko ni suwatte mo yoroshii desu ka? Is it all right if I sit over here? Ii desu ka? Informal. Yoroshii desu ka? Polite. Kono isu tsukatte mo ii desu ka? So, you can use yoroshi like this. Koko de shashin o totte mo ii desu ka? So, now what are the different ways, informal to formal? How will you answer this question? Ii desu yo is one, which is informal with friends. Dozo totte kudasai. You ask somebody ii desu ka, totte mo ii desu ka, and dozo totte kudasai. You are free to take pictures. Totte mo ii desu. So, totte over here is toru, verb toru, which means to take or snatch, and it is not totemo or totemo, which is degree of some adjective. So, please, it is a little different. Totte mo ii desu ka is what you are asking. Totte mo ii desu. It is all right if you take it. So, another polite way of giving permission is kamaimasen, though it is in negative, but meaning is positive. Mas form, but the meaning is in positive. Totte wa kamaimasen, I don't mind. Taro-san, onaka ga suiteiru kara ima tabete mo ii desu ka? Is it all right if we have food now? I am feeling very hungry. Suiteiru means actually empty. My stomach is empty, so can we have now? Kara is used over here just casually, and node, obviously it is very clear that he is hungry, giving reason. So, how will you say in negative? Permission not given. Dame desu is one, very, very direct, informal, to be used with children, in class or at home. Dame desu, not allowed, not permitted. Sumimasen, shashin wa dame desu. So, even though you are using dame over here, you are making it a little polite with sumimasen. Excuse me, it is not allowed. Totte wa ikemasen, you cannot take it. Toru is the verb, so cannot take it. It is not allowed. A little better. Totte wa ikemasen. Same thing. Sumimasen, koko de shashin o toranai de kudasai. Please do not take pictures over here. Toranai hoga ii desu. So, amongst yourselves, you can say somebody wants to take a picture and you can say toranai hoga ii desu. It is better that we do not take pictures over here. And then toranai hoga ii to omoimasu. Koko de shashin totte mo ii desu ka? Iie, toranai hoga ii to omoimasu. Now, these expressions or words like Uroshi, which is polite for ii desu, and kamaimasen, which means I do not mind or it is all right, both can be used in place of ii desu, which is all right, but the situation is very different, and you have already seen it in your previous slide, as the degree of politeness is also different and the meaning also changes, you will see. Koko ni suwatte mo yoroshii desu ka? So, you are asking. This is a question. This is a question with yoroshi. Is it all right? Is it okay? I hope you don't mind. And over here, this is answer. Kamai masen, ii desu. So, in both situations, kamai masen and yoroshi desu, ii is the meaning, but here this is answer to a question and yoroshi is a question with ka. Both mean ii, all right, but used at different places. And the degree you can see also is very different. Ii is very casual, can be spoken to juniors, your friends, inner group, nakama. Kamaimasen is a little better, and then yoroshi is the most polite. So, when you answer, you can say ii desu yo or ii desu or kamai masen, which is more polite than ii. So, you can make questions like this and answer, and you will automatically see the difference between ii desu, kamai masen and yoroshi. Now, a very common picture that you would see in trains, in places, in restaurants, smoking is not permitted, not allowed. This gentleman is smoking and this guy is very angry and he says, Koko de tabako o sutte wa ikemasen. So, he does not use any polite expressions, nothing, a direct order that this is not allowed. Did you not see this sign? You are not permitted over here. What is the polite way of saying exactly the same thing? Well, sumimasen, tabako wa kyoka sarete imasen. Permission, kyoka is permission, permission for smoking has not been given, not been given. Basically, it is not permitted. So, remember this, when you see this written somewhere, you will be reminded of this picture and know exactly what it is saying and what is written. Now, Oni-san is studying, all worked up, and his siblings are playing. So, Oni-san koko de asonde mo ii desu ka? They ask him, and what is his answer? Direct, dame desu, because they are younger to him. At home, informal situation, direct order, dame desu, not permitted. Now, this we have done a number of times. You can practice at home. All the options are given here. The sentence is also given. You can practice with your partner, make different sentences, compare and do kaiwa. Now, there is do shimashita ka. This is very interesting because you can use it in different situations. For example, do shimasu ka. So, you go somewhere, you are looking a little worked up, little worried, or maybe looking for something somewhere, and someone else comes and asks you, do shimashita ka? What happened? What is the matter? Why are you looking so worried, or what are you looking for? So, do shimashita ka. What is the matter? What are you looking for? Now, in this situation, well, there are two people, you ask for opinion, should I buy this thing or should I buy this thing, or should I eat this thing or this thing, and then you say, do shimasu ka, what will you do or what should we do? So, a big difference over here, already the activity is over and something is being done for the activity in this case. Or someone looks at you and you look worried, and then the question comes. Over here there is choice, you are asking opinion of someone else. Do shitai desu ka? Again, similar situation, two things are there or three things are there, should we go, should we not go, should we buy this or should we eat this or not, then do shitai desu ka? What do you want to do? Or you want to do your presentation, you do not want to do your presentation, so somebody will ask you, what do you want to do? Do shitai desu ka? And do shita hoga ii desu ka? Which is a better method or way? What should be done? Which is better? So, you can have two situations again, and do shita hoga ii desu ka? Should I do this or should I do this? In such a situation, do shita hoga ii desu ka is asked. So, all these are very, very common questions, common situations that you will face when you go sometime to Japan, and it is good to always remember these expressions. Now, do shite has nothing to do with this, it is do but shite. Do shite, why are you doing it? Why are you? Do shite tabemasu ka? Do shite ikimasu ka? Do shite aimasu ka? Why are you doing whatever the verb over here? Now, you have this exercise. I have given you these pictures and I want you to find the kanji characters for it and maybe make another word with the same kanji character. I am going to take this up in your next lesson. This is your homework with nakereba narimasen, and with this I would like to end today's class. Lot of things we have done, different ways you have used do, you have understood. We have done nakute mo ii desu ka, revised nakereba narimasen, te mo ii desu. So, practice all this at home and come prepared for your next class. We are going to do question words. So, till then, arigatou gozaimashita. Mata aimashou. Oyasumi nasai.